Imagine for a moment the apex of terror, not a visible enemy, not a war with borders and armies, but an insidious, unseen shadow that creeps into your homes, your bodies, your very lungs. Think of the panic of watching your neighbor, your brother, your mother, succumb within hours with black buboes, and a fever that burns the soul without explanation, without a cure, or even a name for the monster devouring them. This is not fiction. This is the story of a silent apocalypse, a plague so voracious, so indiscriminate, that it swept away a third of a continent's population, decimating entire cities, shattering faith, and redrawing the map of civilization. It is a narrative of unimaginable suffering, of absolute despair, and of the brutal resilience of a humanity that found itself face to face with annihilation itself. Prepare for a journey into the heart of the medieval darkness. This is the Black Death. And before we delve into the horrors and mysteries of that era, if you're ready to uncover history's deepest shadows with us, please click the subscribe button below and join our community. Your presence helps us continue bringing you stories as powerful as this one. In the heart of the 14th century, Europe was a vibrant tapestry of feudal kingdoms, expanding trade routes, and a society deeply rooted in faith and hierarchy. Cities swelled with growing populations, agriculture brought forth bountiful harvests, and nascent innovations began to pepper the continent. Yet, beneath this surface of burgeoning progress, an unseen and untamable threat lurked, poised to unleash a scourge of biblical proportions that would ultimately redefine the very course of Western civilization. It arrived not with sword or army, but with the minuscule bite of a flea. The story of the Black Death does not begin in Europe, but thousands of miles to the east, across the vast, arid steppes of Central Asia. This was a region inhabited by ancient populations of rodents and their associated fleas, long-term carriers of a virulent and deadly bacterium, Yersinia pestis. This bacterium, an ancestor to strains that persist even today, existed in a delicate, often brutal equilibrium with its natural rodent hosts. However, the 14th century was a period of unprecedented global connectivity, driven by the sprawling trade networks of the legendary Silk Road and the vast, unifying reach of the Mongol Empire. The Mongols, with their immense armies and their dominion over a territory stretching from China to Eastern Europe, inadvertently forged conduits, not just for goods and ideas, but also for silent, insidious pathogens. It was along these vibrant arteries of commerce that the plague found its insidious path. Merchants and travelers, blissfully unaware, carried in their caravans and ship holds not only silk and spices, but also the unwitting vectors of death, the ubiquitous ship rat, infested with infected fleas. The bacterium journeyed in the wake of prosperity, a silent shadow trailing the burgeoning flow of trade. Historical and genetic evidence now strongly suggests that the plague first made its devastating impact in China during the early 14th century, unleashing catastrophic outbreaks that preceded its westward journey. The sheer scale of death in the East, though often less documented than in Europe, was likely immense, a grim prelude to the catastrophe awaiting the West. The pivotal turning point for Europe, the very gateway for the calamitous entry of the plague, was the bustling Crimean port city of Kaffa. In 1346, Kaffa found itself under a relentless siege by the Mongol forces of the Golden Horde, led by the formidable Khan Shani Beg. As the siege dragged on, and the very Mongol troops themselves began to succumb to a terrifying, mysterious illness, a tactic of biological warfare, both gruesome and macabre, was allegedly employed. The besiegers reportedly catapulted the decaying corpses of plague victims over the cities as formidable walls, hoping to infect the defenders within. While the precise epidemiological impact of this specific tactic is still debated by modern historians, the ultimate result was tragically unequivocal. The plague gained an undeniable foothold inside Kaffa. Genoese merchant ships, filled with desperate refugees fleeing the collapsing siege and the spreading pestilence, departed from Kaffa bound for Italy. They were unwitting vessels of doom, carrying an invisible cargo of death that would soon decimate the continent. These ships made landfall in Sicilian ports like Messina in October 1347, and within mere days, the terrifying disease erupted with horrifying ferocity among the already crowded coastal populations. The symptoms were chillingly distinct and unmistakable. Large, painful, blackened swellings or buboes would emerge in the groins, armpits, and necks of the infected, rapidly followed by a searing fever, agonizing delirium, and almost invariably a grim, swift death, often within 2 to 7 days. The mortality rate was staggering, frequently exceeding 50%, and in many fulminant cases, it reached a staggering 90% for those afflicted. From these initial Italian beachheads, the plague spread with a terrifying, almost supernatural speed, sweeping across Europe like an unstoppable wildfire. The bustling coastal cities, serving as vital centers of trade and densely packed human populations, were the first and most severely ravaged. From Messina, it quickly spread to the great maritime republics of Genoa and Venice, then relentlessly moved inland to cities like Pisa and Florence. By 1348, the plague had already reached the grand cities of Marseille and Paris in France, and by the end of that same year, it had made its grim entry onto the shores of England. No one understood its true cause. Explanations veered wildly, ranging from divine punishment for human sins, unfavorable planetary alignments, the nefarious influence of miasmas, or even malicious conspiracies aimed at poisoning wells and food supplies. The terror gripping the populace was palpable and paralyzing. Physicians, utterly impotent in the face of such a relentless killer, watched helplessly as their patients perished by the thousands. There was no known cure, no genuine scientific understanding of the disease's transmission. Entire families were extinguished within a matter of days, their homes left empty and haunted. The very streets reeked of death and in pervasive, suffocating fear. Scientific comprehension was utterly absent, and responses were often born of sheer desperation and deep-seated superstition. Many interpreted the plague as the literal Last Judgment, the wrath of God manifest upon the earth. And as the disease relentlessly advanced, an eerie, unsettling silence began to descend upon once vibrant cities, broken only by the mournful laments of the dying and the incessant, chilling tolling of funeral bells. Europe was teetering on the precipice of an unimaginable abyss, and the Black Death was only just beginning its devastating, transformative work. As the Black Death secured its foothold in Europe, its spread became a grim testament to the interconnectedness of medieval society. From the initial port cities, the plague radiated inland along rivers, roads, and established trade routes. Caravans carrying goods, pilgrims on religious journeys, and even fleeing refugees inadvertently became carriers, scattering the seeds of the pestilence far and wide. Major urban centers, with their dense populations and often unsanitary conditions, acted as amplifiers, becoming epicenters from which the disease surged outwards into the surrounding countryside. By 1348, it had engulfed Italy, France, and parts of Spain. By 1349, it swept through England, Ireland, and Scandinavia. The terrifying swiftness of its advance left populations paralyzed with fear, offering little time for organized resistance or understanding. The symptoms of the plague were a horrifying spectacle, leaving an indelible mark on the collective psyche. Victims would typically develop large, painful, swollen lymph nodes, known as buboes, in the groin, armpit, or neck. These buboes could range in size from an egg to an apple, often turning black and oozing pus, a sight that instilled immediate terror. Accompanying these swellings were a sudden onset of high fever, chills, severe headaches, extreme weakness, and an overwhelming nausea. Some victims would also experience purplish or blackish spots on the skin, caused by internal bleeding, giving the plague its ominous name, the Black Death. The disease's progression was brutal and swift. Most victims perished within a few days of the first symptoms appearing, their bodies rapidly deteriorating. For some, the plague manifested in its even more virulent pneumotic form, attacking the lungs and spreading directly through airborne droplets from coughs, leading to an even faster and more agonizing death, often without the telltale buboes. The scale of death quickly overwhelmed all societal structures. The sheer number of fatalities led to an unprecedented social collapse. Families abandoned their sick loved ones, fearing contagion. Parents fled from their dying children, and children abandoned their parents. Funeral rites, deeply important in medieval society, became impossible to perform as priests died at alarming rates, and the sheer volume of corpses surpassed the capacity to bury them individually. Mass graves became a common, gruesome sight, often hastily dug pits where bodies were piled indiscriminately, sometimes without a coffin or shroud, a profound affront to the spiritual beliefs of the time. In the face of such unimaginable horror, traditional authority structures crumbled. Law and order often broke down as officials, nobility, and even royalty fled the infected cities or succumbed to the disease themselves. Without governance, looting became rampant and moral norms eroded. Fear morphed into desperation, leading to a profound crisis of faith. Why would God inflict such suffering? Was it divine punishment? This led to the rise of extremist religious movements, such as the Flagellants groups, who roamed from town to town, publicly whipping themselves to atone for their sins, and those of humanity believing that self-mutilation would appease God's wrath. Tragically, this era also saw a horrific increase in the persecution of minority groups, particularly Jewish communities, who were often scapegoated and accused of poisoning wells, leading to widespread pogroms and massacres across Europe. Responses to the plague were largely desperate, ineffective, and often based on superstition or misinformation. Physicians, armed with little understanding of germ theory, resorted to ineffective remedies. Bloodletting, concoctions of herbs, poultices made of various substances applied to the buboes, or even attempts to ward off bad air with fragrant herbs and elaborate masks. Some communities attempted rudimentary quarantines, isolating the sick or preventing outsiders from entering, but these measures were rarely comprehensive or consistently enforced. For many, the only perceived escape was flight. Those who could afford it fled the cities for the countryside, inadvertently carrying the disease with them and spreading it to previously untouched rural areas. The immediate impact on daily life was catastrophic. Fields lay fallow, crops rotted, and livestock wandered untended as the laborers perished. Workshops stood silent, markets emptied, and churches, once bustling centers of community, echoed with silence or the desperate cries of the dying. Whole villages were sometimes wiped out entirely, leaving behind ghostly settlements. The demographic devastation was unlike anything ever experienced. Estimates vary, but it is widely believed that between 30% and 50% of Europe's population perished within a few short years, a loss of tens of millions of lives. In some regions, entire generations were almost annihilated. The scale of death was so immense that, in many places, there simply weren't enough survivors to bury the dead, leading to scenes of unimaginable horror. This immediate aftermath was a landscape of profound grief, economic paralysis, and spiritual questioning. The familiar order of the world had been shattered, and those who survived were left to grapple with a new, terrifying reality. The sheer number of vacant lands, empty houses, and skilled labor shortages would, paradoxically, set the stage for unprecedented changes in the social and economic fabric of Europe, but not before the continent had endured its darkest hour, forever marked by the silent apocalypse that had swept across its lands. As the Black Death finally receded, leaving behind a continent scarred and depopulated, Europe faced a stark and chilling reality. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of profound silence, lingering fear, and economic desolation. Estimates suggest that between 30% and 50% of the population perished, and in some regions, the toll was even higher. Entire villages lay abandoned, fields lay fallow, and the once bustling sounds of medieval life were replaced by an eerie quiet. The sheer magnitude of death meant that existing economic and social structures, which had largely remained unchanged for centuries, could no longer function. The most immediate and profound consequence was on labor and the economy. With millions dead, especially among the peasant and artisan classes, a drastic scarcity of labor emerged. Suddenly, the surviving peasants and workers, who had always been tied to the land or to rigid guilds, found themselves in a position of unprecedented bargaining power. Lords, desperate for hands to work their fields and keep their estates viable, were forced to offer higher wages, better working conditions, and even outright freedom from traditional feudal obligations. This marked a significant, albeit gradual, decline of the feudal system, which had been the bedrock of medieval society. Paid labor became more prevalent, and many serfs were able to purchase their freedom or simply abandon their lord's land for better opportunities elsewhere. Agriculture shifted, with some lands previously used for labor-intensive grain farming converted to less labor-intensive sheep farming for wool production. These demographic and economic shifts inevitably led to massive social and political upheaval. The traditional hierarchies began to crack under the strain. The nobility, whose wealth and power were tied to land and the labor to work it, saw their incomes plummet and their authority challenged. The church, which had promised divine protection and salvation, lost immense credibility as its prayers failed to stop the plague, and many of its own clergy died, often fleeing their duties. This skepticism sowed seeds for future religious reforms. With increased social mobility, a new class of wealthier peasants and skilled urban workers began to emerge, challenging the established order. This newfound empowerment, coupled with attempts by the aristocracy to roll back wage gains after the immediate crisis passed, ignited widespread unrest. Peasant revolts, like the Jacquerie in France and the Peasants' Revolt in England, erupted across Europe, directly fueled by the changed power dynamics and a refusal to return to the old ways of subservience. The religious impact of the Black Death was complex and contradictory. For some, the plague confirmed the belief in God's wrath and led to deeper piety, spurring movements like the Flagellants. For others, it shattered faith, leading to widespread hedonism and moral decay as people believed life was fleeting and judgment inevitable. The church, already facing internal issues, was severely weakened. The loss of vast numbers of educated clergy meant that many inexperienced and less qualified individuals filled critical roles, leading to a decline in the quality of religious services and deepening public disillusionment. New forms of personal spirituality and mysticism also gained prominence, as individuals sought a more direct connection to the divine in a world that seemed to have abandoned them. Culturally and intellectually, the plague left an indelible mark. Art and literature of the period became deeply preoccupied with themes of death, decay, and the transience of life. The Danse Macabre, depicting skeletons leading people of all social classes to their graves, became a pervasive artistic motif. While devastating, the plague paradoxically contributed to the intellectual ferment that would eventually lead to the Renaissance. The questioning of established authorities, the sudden abundance of resources per capita, and the increased value placed on human life due to its scarcity, all created a fertile ground for new ideas. The shortage of Latin-speaking clergy even encouraged the rise of vernacular languages in literature and education. Over the subsequent centuries, Europe slowly began to recover demographically. The scars of the plague remained, but new generations, hardened by the memory of the catastrophe, built a new normal. The population would not return to its pre-plague levels for over 150 years, but the continent had been fundamentally transformed. The plague accelerated the decline of feudalism, stimulated innovation in agriculture, altered social structures and arguably, by shaking the medieval world to its core, inadvertently cleared a path for the social, economic, and intellectual shifts that characterized the transition to the early modern era. The Black Death stands as a somber yet pivotal chapter in human history. It was a dark and terrifying testament to the fragility of human life and the power of nature. Yet from its ashes, a new, more dynamic Europe began to emerge, forever changed by the silent apocalypse that swept across its lands, a brutal catalyst for the world that was to come.